Dellamina's upward probing thrust had reached the heart. This was a crude, elementary way of killing a man. It was actually one of the things that prison inmates did to one another. When they pushed a blade upward, they tried to move it around a bit, like a driver manipulating a standard transmission, so they called it running the gears on someone. But he hadn't wished to have Dellamina's death look like expert workmanship. That might warn the next one that he had come back to take care of this problem. He stepped to the rack by the sink, took a clean dish towel, and wiped off the handle of the knife. He knelt on the floor for a moment and looked more closely at Dellamina. The heart and the lungs had to be stopped. The human body could take an incredible amount of battering, piercing, even burning, and heal rapidly and go on with undiminished strength for another 40 years. For a pro, death had to happen right away with no uncertainty. Before he left, the person had to be dead. Not dying, but dead and cooling off. He couldn't have somebody get up after he was gone. None of his ever had, but it was a concern. He put his hand on Michael Dellamina's carotid artery to be sure his heart had stopped, then tugged a button from Dellamina's shirt, extracted a few inches of thread, and held the thin white filament in front of his nostrils. The thread didn't move. He dropped it on Dellamina's chest with the button, touched the artery one more time, stood, and walked. He went out the side door of the house and got into the plain white van. He had parked so close to the side door that he only had to take 2 steps and he was in the driver's seat behind tinted windows. He had a red shop rag caught in the back door of the van, so it hung down to cover the license plate. He backed out of the driveway, shifted and accelerated to a moderate speed, and proceeded down the street. After he had gone a mile or 2, he turned into the parking lot of a supermarket, drove around to the rear of the building, got out, and stuffed the rag, the coveralls, and the clipboard into a bag in the dumpster. He pulled back onto the road and merged into the traffic again. He drove carefully and lawfully, as he always did, and never risked having a cop pull him over. He wore the blue baseball cap and a pair of sunglasses because he knew that if anyone saw him through the windshield, what they'd remember was a baseball cap and sunglasses. In 20 minutes, he was 20 miles away, and in 40 he was in another county at the lot where he had rented the van a couple of hours ago. He returned it and drove the rented car he had left on a nearby street toward the airport. The distinguishing feature of the killing business was its premeditation. Most amateurs got caught because they were too inexperienced to look far enough ahead. They made plans to kill some enemy, but didn't devote much thought to what they would do with the body. Some of them didn't even think clearly about their alibis. It was as though the killing itself were a high wall ahead of them. They thought so much about having to climb it that they couldn't get their eyes to focus on what was beyond it. Even the ones who bothered to construct alibis often made foolish mistakes. They would go to a movie and pay with a credit card, sneak out in the middle of the film to do the killing, and then get caught on a security camera driving back into the parking lot. Or they'd kill their wives and then call their girlfriends on their cell phones, and the phone company would have a record of which repeater tower picked up the signal. When they didn't make mistakes, they still had trouble. The truth was, if you were the police department's favorite suspect, almost any set of precautions you took would be inadequate. If there was no real evidence of guilt, the police would start finding fibers in your car or house that were not inconsistent with the fibers in the dead man's clothes or carpets. A pro was never the cop's favorite suspect because he had no clear connection with the victim. He knew a lot about the business because he had been raised in it. His parents had been killed in a car crash when he was 10. His nearest relative was his mother's younger sister, who was in college in California and barely made it to the funeral. She had no room in her schedule for raising anybody's 10-year-old child. But a neighborhood man named Eddie Mastruski had volunteered to take the boy in, teach him some values and the habit of work. Eddie was the local butcher, a man who drove a good car, lived in a good house, and had a reputation for honest weights and fresh meat. In those days, in a working-class neighborhood, no one thought much about it. There was a boy who needed a home for a few years, and Eddie had one. In later years, the boy suspected